How you doing, fam? This is Chris Mazer here. AMD's RX 7900 XTX has finally been released, and right now you're probably contemplating on whether to purchase it because now you will compare it next to the RTX 4090. Maybe you had Nvidia for this whole time and you never had an AMD graphics card. There's nothing wrong with it. Nvidia did have the dominant hand in the graphics card market, but now with AMD trying to be a little bit more competitive, it's a time to switch over to Team Red when it comes to graphics cards. We will dissect every little thing when it comes down to it, but not to bore you, at first is the specifications of both of these graphics cards. First, I will show the AMD 7900 XTX specifications, and you can pause if you want. You can take a look at it real quick. And next is the RTX 4090 specifications, as you can take a look. If you're looking for any specific parts, please check down in the description box down below, as I do have this timestamped. But moving on, now you want to know which is better, which are the advantages of each graphics card. First off, the 7900 XTX, we will talk about pixel rate. It is at 480 compared to Nvidia's, which is 443.5. Another really important factor is the power usage of both graphics card. The 7900 XTX has obviously lower graphics card usage. AMD uses more of the traditional approach when it comes to their PCI Express connections. They do have 8-pin connections that you connect to. The maximum TDP for their card is 355 watts. There are reports where they had spiked up to as high as 413 watts. But then again, those are spikes, and that won't be the steady output of the graphics card. So it is a good thing that it does use lower usage compared to the RTX 4090, where they use 450 watts, which will obviously require you to have a more powerful power supply. With the 7900 XTX, you only need an 800 watt power supply compared to the RTX 4090, where you need a minimum of 850 watts power supply. There is no need to upgrade. But moving on to the next portion of this, AMD also has a faster memory bandwidth, where it reaches 2500 megahertz compared to Nvidia, where it's 1325 megahertz. Also, another reminder here is that the 7900 XTX does use TSMC's Taiwan Semiconductors 5nm chipsets. Now they will combine two different chipsets. That isn't really always the best case, especially when it comes to these chiplets. So the render output units are also better when it comes to the 7900 XTX. It has 192 versus 176. It's a lot more thinner compared to Nvidia's RTX 4090. Compare side to side with each GPU. The RTX 4090 still looks like a big monster compared to the 7900 XTX. The dimensions between the two are it's 207 millimeters by 121.9 millimeters by 53.3 millimeters. Versus the Nvidia's RTX 4090 Founders Edition, which is 304 millimeters by 137 millimeters by 61 millimeters. You can see the size difference there. Even the weight is a large difference between the two. The 7900 XTX only weighs 1,799 grams compared to Nvidia's RTX 4090 Founders Edition, which weighs 2,186 grams. Another big advantage that you have with the 7900 XTX, going back to the power connections, is if you have a fear connecting to the 12-volt high power connection. I know it's more of a faded topic. We all know what the issue is when it comes to Nvidia's connection issue. There's always going to be some sort of problems with either or when it comes to these things. And for Nvidia specifically is the 12-volt high power connection. The findings were that nobody was properly securing the connection to the graphics card. Now, I'm saying that this is Nvidia's fault. It's the fact that there's more of a quality control issue when it comes to it. If you're afraid to be one of those unlucky ones where you have a little bit of plastic inside of the pin where it can prevent the pin from actually connecting, where you cause a little bit of resistance, therefore can cause a short to your graphics card, which is the last thing anybody wants to do. If you do purchase the 7900 XTX, another negative part about it is it won't be able to overclock it as well as Nvidia's. Sure, it can be done. You can definitely overclock a AMD Radeon 7900 XTX, but you won't accomplish as much as Nvidia's. And if you want to take up the challenge, you can, but it's just much more easier if you go with the Nvidia RTX 4090 to do that. You practically have unlocked ability. Now I'm going to go over the RTX 4090 advantages. You have a GPU clock speed of 2300 megahertz versus 1900 megahertz. You also have higher effective memory. You'll get 21,200 megahertz versus 200,000 megahertz. The memory bandwidth is also 1018 gigabytes per second compared to 960 gigabytes per second. Nvidia always excelled here when it comes to teraflops, 82.58 teraflops versus 61 teraflops from the 7900 XTX. It also has higher textures where it reaches 1290 compared to 960. There's also a lot more transistors on Nvidia's. And again, it is a 4nm chipset compared to a 5nm chipset. That's 76 billion compared to 58 billion transistors. And you also have more texture mapping units when it comes to Nvidia, where it's 512 compared to 384. It is an Nvidia card where ray tracing does excel a lot better when it comes to Nvidia. That is no secret. Everybody knows that. Even if you have an AMD card, you can admit that the ray tracing is much better when it comes to Nvidia. But not everybody cares about ray tracing. But if you do, it does have more ray tracing cores where it has 128 compared to 96. And one of the most interesting findings when it comes to power consumption, it turns out the 7900 XTX ironically does use up a little bit more power. AMD is known for its glitches when it comes to the idle problems that it runs into. When you compare their monitor usage, you look at Nvidia's RTX 4090 compared to a 7900 XTX where it's using up to 102 watts during idle. So if you have a multi-monitor setup just like I do, you will be using nearly quadruple wattage if you had the same setup. And again, nothing is ever perfect when it comes to graphics cards, especially if you are one of the first people to receive them. We all know it can get buggy, especially when it comes to AMD's drivers. Nvidia's drivers is also not as great when you first get the graphics card, because I've always seen buggy issues when you first get any graphics card, especially when you get the first batch. Now, the advantage of the 7900 XTX, you do also have DisplayPort 2.1. Sure, you have it, but again, it doesn't really have that power to where you really need to use DisplayPort 2.1. Sure, you can use it, but the performance, well, we'll get to that because I want to bring up the benchmarks here, and I got benchmarks from multiple sources. I don't want to look like it biased in any type of way, so you can take a look at the numbers yourself, and you can look up other benchmarks if you want to cross-reference this. But the benchmarks that I did use was from Tom's Hardware, Tweaktown, and I think Tech Power Up. So I have 3 of these benchmarks, so you can get a good idea. You can take a look at Metro Exodus at 1440p. I feel is the sweet point between the two, because not everyone's going to game in 4K, and you'll be able to tell how well each graphics card will do if you do choose to go 4K with either or graphics card. Metro Exodus, you are getting 118 frames per second when it comes to the RTX 4090 compared to 97.5. Far Cry 6 is 158 frames per second compared to 147. 82 frames per second on Flight Simulator versus 84 frames per second. And Cyberpunk has 86 frames per second compared to 42 frames per second. Now, this is going to be off of Tweaktown now, also 1440p, so that way you can cross-reference, as Metro Exodus has 115 frames per second compared to 72. Now you have 138 average frames per second compared to 132 on Cyberpunk 2077. Tomb Raider, you get 356 frames per second versus 278 And then you have Forza 5, which is 213 frames per second compared to 118 frames per second. Now, Tech Power Up, they have 263.3 frames per second compared to 228.9 frames per second. Far Cry 6, 193.1 frames per second compared to 202 frames per second. Forza 5 is 189.3 frames per second compared to 147.8 frames per second. And Cyberpunk is 142 frames per second compared to 126 frames per second. As you can see, they are perceivably got different frame rates for their benchmarks. Again, they all are running different systems, and it all depends on the type of PC that you have that you will want to use to upgrade your graphics card. Now, keep in mind, AMD Radeon 7900 XTX does feature Infinity Cache, which is another useful feature, especially if you do have an AMD processor. I feel if you have the two, they will be beneficial to work together. Obviously, the RTX 4090 is a monster in itself, but the pricing is a bit high, where it's $1,599 USD compared to the 7900 XTX, which is $999 USD. Is it really worth getting either or? And I gotta say, it's actually best to probably stick to the RTX 30 series or the 6800 series or 6900 XT, because you can still purchase them at a great deal. You can purchase these brand new graphics cards, sure, but you will be paying the price for it. And the price will soon fade into next year, because once next year hits, expect to see improvement when it comes to these graphics cards. Expect to see TI variants, expect to see 7950 XT or XTX show up sometime in the near future. Why get something like this where you could get a 6800 XTX for about $600 or a RTX 3080 Ti for about $700 to $800? So you do have these options. Another thing I do have to say, the most similar things that they both have together is that they're both 24 gigabytes of VRAM. Of course, the Nvidia RTX 4090 has a GDDR6X compared to GDDR6. The slots that they take up is 2.5 card expansion slots. So the biggest issue, like I said, when it comes to new graphics card, expect to run into issues, plus paying a premium price for what you do purchase. It sounds ridiculous, but that's just the way it is, compared to having something that's already refined, which is a RTX 30 series or a 6900 XTX. So hopefully this video made a lot of sense to you. If you choose either or, they both do have their advantages and disadvantages. Bam guys, I hope you found this content very useful. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you know anybody else who is into PC and tech, make sure you share this video with them. And if you're not part of the big wonderful fan bam, make sure you go down and hit the subscribe button for more, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. And for all the newest updates, make sure you follow my Twitter handle right here, as it is the same as my TikTok and IG as well. So fam guys, if I left out anything that is important to know when you are thinking of purchasing any of these graphics cards, let me know in the comments down below. Or is there something that you want to personally say of what you think about either or graphics card? Let everyone know in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is Chris Mizo signing out.